So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another installment of Speaking of Seeing. This evening, Bill and I are going to talk about rich color. Hello, Bill.
Hello. Are you saying rich as in saturated or rich as in money?
Well, could be either, and that's really
Yeah.
part of the point of it, isn't it? And I would just like everybody to note that this evening, Bill's name is giant on the screen because he did mention that he didn't like that his name was so small before. So, in case anybody's wondering, rich color Bill Wadman, it's because Bill wanted it that way.
It's also because in Scotland they have a different tone for sarcasm, apparently.
Anyway, rich color. It is about color as we know it, to do with saturation, what we see. But of course, Bill and I in the past have talked very recently about rich and poor, trying to unpick and unpack a little bit about how wealth or poverty impacts, in our case last time, mainly painting, although we looked at Martin Parr's work as well. We do have the classic rich boy up first, William Eggleston. In actual fact, that's why we started ever talking about anything to do with rich and poor. So, Bill, William Eggleston, what do you think?
Well, okay, first of all, I want to know why you chose this particular picture.
Because I really like bubblegum pink.
Yeah. I will be fair to say that I don't think that you are picking the strongest William Eggleston picture to represent him here in this menagerie.
But it doesn't mean that it's not my favorite picture of his.
Is it your favorite picture of his?
Yep.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I personally would not have gone with this one, but I'll meet you where you are.
Okay.
Um, William Eggleston, yeah, look, there is a lot written about William Eggleston. There's a lot told. The mythology of William Eggleston, walking into MoMA in 1974 and 75 and getting his own show, being an unknown, you know, kid from Tennessee. I guess he's from Memphis, right? Um, and he had a house for his wife and a house for his mistress, and they knew about each other and all this kind of stuff, and the drugs and the drinking and the he's some sort of weird, but at the same time he's nerdy, so he's like a weird nerdy Hemingway-esque kind of photographer character,
I don't think you should go there. I just don't think you should go there.
I can't stand Hemingway, so is that all right? Does that make it better or not? I think
Maybe.
Hemingway was a giant jerk.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
I mean, the impression I get of Eggleston in interviews and things is that, he's one of those people you meet who's so full of their own importance. And he does have reason for it, but only up to a point. And after that, I would have to be very aware of how I reacted to him personally, which is why when I look at his photographs, maybe there's an element of me sometimes trying to diminish him, because he is a great photographer. And in terms of people studying photography, he's extremely important. Um, and obviously anybody studying color photography needs to know William Eggleston. He is a pioneer of color photography as an art.
Okay, but here, let me ask you a question. I think we've talked about this before a little bit, but have you looked at any work that William Eggleston has done in the last 30 years? Like, is William Eggleston because of the stuff from the guide that everyone knows? You know, or is William, like, was there a period of time at which he was on fire artistically, and the rest of the time he's just sort of coasting on the speed that he gained back then?
No, I don't think I agree with that. I would say that there are certain things that hamper somebody's progress in anything in life. And I certainly think in some artists' cases, stuff that would normally hamper people's progress for normal people, for regular civilians, sometimes it's the opposite for artists. So I think, for example, I can't comment on William Eggleston's alcoholism, although I know his family obviously are extremely concerned about it. But I would say that his lifestyle has fed into then this louche passivity in the work. And so where perhaps some people might consider he's switched off, actually that's where I think he becomes his most ingenious. I think there's a few anecdotal things about Eggleston that are, maybe they don't seem relevant, but they're very relevant for me. I was reading somewhere about, you know, you go into his apartment and there's a little plaque above the door and it says, you know, this man is something like he's an alcoholic. He is under controlled alcoholic medication or something. And
Really? Okay.
in violation of this, if you're found to be entering with alcohol, we can prosecute you, the Eggleston family. And so it makes me feel about Eggleston now, he's an old man now, but that he's very tightly controlled in a life now, whereas before he had this enormous liberty, and that was about his privilege and it was about his lifestyle. And again, that's been very well documented. But I love that sense. And I'm saying I love that sense. I feel desperately sorry about it, but I kind of, I find something inspiring in somebody who's otherwise very privileged and expansive life is contracted down, and where something about their eye speaks to them about this passive observation of things that through color communicates fragments of much bigger stories. I think it's really beautiful. And it annoys me that I think that, because I want to hate the photographs always, because I don't like Eggleston, the man, from what I read about him.
Sure. Well, I mean, separating artists from their work is a whole other conversation we could have one time, because that's a whole other can of worms.
The reason
Eggleston,
this photograph, you know, I kind of glibly said to you, I picked it because of the bubblegum pink, but actually, I think for color photographers, you know, you've got the big hitters in terms of color, like red, obviously. Red! You see it in everything. Lots of the photographs coming up have a heavy dose of red. But in this, we have something that is on the edge, I think, of being really sinister.
I mean, this is all just weird pastel-y kind of colors, right?
But I think that feeds into that, and it heightens it, actually, enhances a sense of...
here's my thing about Eggleston and about, okay, I'm going to go out on a limb here and you're not going to like it, or other people might not like it. My thing about Eggleston, my thing about a number of these other photographers we're about to see, especially sort of the color street photographers of the mid to late 20th century, is that I feel like there are some William Eggleston photographs that are absolutely up there with the greatest paintings of all time. The same is true of Joel Meyerowitz. The same is true of a number of these people. But I think if you took 500 of their pictures and mixed them up with 500 pictures of somebody else and picked 500 pictures off of Flickr that were pictures of streets in New York, I don't know that you would be able to pick out the William Eggleston ones necessarily. I think there's a few that would really stand out. And then I think that there would be a whole bunch that were just pictures of a trash can on the corner, and you don't know whether they're Eggleston or Meyerowitz or me or my mother with her cell phone. And maybe I think that that's
part of the beauty.
Maybe, but then what is their beauty? That, you know what I mean? Then their beauty is every picture of every trash can on the corner, right? You know, it's like you and I had this via text the other day. It's like if you can't, you don't like defining something and putting labels on things, but if you don't put labels on things and define things, then you can't really talk about them, because you can't say what they are in the first place to be able to have the conversation about them, you know?
I don't know, if I was pulling this just out of nowhere and I didn't know it was a William Eggleston photograph, I'm not sure I would be able to say that, yes, this is a William Eggleston photograph, in the same way that I might assume things about photographs with heavy diagonals and cars with like yellow. There's a lot of yellow dominance in
the more 70s looking stuff.
Yeah, but I would be able to say that there's still always a quality in Eggleston's work that is much emulated. But of course, then I would also know that Eggleston's work doesn't come out of nothing. You know, he wasn't just arriving and, you know, suddenly this entire photographic sensibility belonged to him. he's classed as a pioneer of color photography because he was one of the early 70s photographers like Stephen Shore, who's coming up, who was able, through perhaps their privilege, to help the world start to see color photography as an art form in its own right. Don't forget, a lot of the other people who were photographing in the early to mid 20th century in color were doing so as true pioneers. They were largely ignored.
Absolutely. That's the thing. I don't think that it's that Eggleston and Shore were actually the pioneers. I think they just happened to be there when the table tilted over to where color was accepted.
I
and
still
they
don't
happened to
think
be
that's
two
giving them
people.
enough credit, though, Bill. I think that it's true to say that Shore and Eggleston probably helped tilt the table.
Although, interestingly enough, I have a friend who worked very closely with Shore for a number of years on a show at MoMA recently, and their stories to me, they liked him very much, but he also sounded extremely privileged and cocky, and sort of that it was inevitable that they would be great. That sort of talk.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, and there are a lot of Shore photographs. There is a era of Stephen Shore photographs that I think are lovely and not expansive. What's the word I'm looking for? That have a feeling that I think is really special. There are 80% of the rest of Stephen Shore stuff I think is very ordinary, personally. And I'm not any sort of great, art historian. I'm just a photographer who can look at other people's work. And I think the same is true for Eggleston. So it's interesting to me that I think both of them had their high period, and are bouncing around. But you're right. Look how many people were. Look, color photography was invented 50 years before these guys got their first shows.
Oh no, well before that. I mean, you're thinking about.
It was
Scotsman,
commonly acceptable. Yeah.
James
Go
Clerk
ahead.
Maxwell, working.
The picture of the ribbon, right?
Yep, like the kind of tartan thing. Early color stuff was really, like a lot of early photography that we know in kind of Western culture, was very much about science. It was a show off for science.
Sure.
Again, it was the pleasure and experiment of privilege. Photography, really.
Right, but color photography became accessible, at Kodachrome and that kind of stuff, right?
It did.
And
I think that's why it became such a stigma to class color photography as an art, because if you think about it, color photography was seen as extraordinarily modern, and that where black and white had kind of found its feet in its autonomous language, visual language, color photography was sidelined into kind of commercial work. So
sure.
to be
Advertising.
a commercial enterprise, color photography, it's actually very difficult to transition out of that perception, because I think a lot of people consider color photography actually to be
gauche,
gauche and brash.
but isn't all of that just just bad? None of that is fundamentally true. It's just society. I guess it's the art world ultimately being sort of ultra conservative or reactionary, right? Being religious about what they consider art. I mean, the same thing happens today, right?
Well, it's sometimes it's a shame that the people looking at the art and judging it are also the people who make the art. In as much as it's the same culture that spews it out that drinks it back up. And I think for that, for photographers working, and again, we're going to talk about Saul Leiter coming up, but, his work really wasn't rated as art. I mean, he'd been a commercial photographer, but he had like a renaissance in the early 80s.
But I think that Saul Leiter is an example of someone where I look at his work and I don't think it looks like every other picture of a trash can on the corner. Saul had a point of view that I don't necessarily know that these guys had as tightly focused.
Hmm.
By the way, I got to tell you the time that Saul sat next to me during a luncheon, and he was amazing.
Oh, Bill, you're so cool.
No, I'm not cool, but it was
I've
pretty
never
cool.
sat.
It was
I've
pretty
never
cool.
sat next to anyone. I've not even sat next to you properly before. I've only ever sat opposite you digitally or virtually like this. Just one more thing about Eggleston.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's very sobering about the kind of the context of color that we're talking about here. It was actually, he was kind of rabid, I think, for acceptance as a photographer. You and I have talked about this before. In fact, I think we might even have mentioned it on our previous conversation, Rich and Poor. But a I would say former idol of his was Cartier-Bresson.
Sure.
But apparently once they met at a party, I don't know if you know what Cartier-Bresson said to Eggleston.
No, what did he say?
He said, I'm going to read it out. William, color is bullshit. And he said, that was it. He walked away. The only thing
Well,
he said to him.
To be fair, Cartier-Bresson was a bit of an a-hole too. So it's like,
It's going to be a running theme. Maybe we should just do a whole session on
jerk photographers.
Yeah, that's next, people. Watch out for that.
Keep it out next week.
Anyway,
Joel Meyerowitz.
Yeah, I'm going to soften into this one because actually to talk about Meyerowitz and Eggleston is like talking about chalk and cheese for me in terms of how I emotionally respond to the idea of them as the photographer.
Everything I've ever read about Meyerowitz or seen any interviews, he seems like a very sweet man.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm talking about people I don't know, I've never met, I've not spoken to them, but I think there's like a legacy of their character. I find when I look at this kind of work I've got on the screen now, this is color at its most beautifully poetic, really.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Before you go on, have you ever seen an Eggleston print that was a dye transfer print that he's sort of known for in real life?
Yeah, I've seen.
Okay, did that make any difference to you?
No.
Okay, we'll talk about that later then. Go ahead.
I mean, the so-called poet of color photography is Ernst Haas, also coming up in a minute. But actually, for me, it's this guy. I think when we look at color, color is, if we're lucky enough to be sighted people, and we're lucky enough within that scope of our vision to have a full appreciation of color, I'm always astonished at how little people actually properly invest or think about color. Obviously, we think about color, we go and buy our clothes, or we go and buy a pot of paint for our rooms, or whatever we're doing, we think we're engaged with color. But actually, lots of people really aren't. I've observed this throughout my entire life as somebody who is absolutely and endlessly fascinated with color.
I'm not, as we've discussed before.
Yeah,
so go ahead.
Strange. No, but when I look at this, this is like a melt into color. You can go and stand in front of the Rothko paintings and you can be absorbed into the surface of them. Although there's stuff that's representational within this frame, nonetheless, I'm still kind of absorbed into the color space.
Do you think that part of that is to do with the fact that color is more subjective overall, both how it's represented in the sense that, looking at a file on a screen versus a print in a book versus a thing on the wall, how it's lit changes the color, how you perceive color. Maybe you're more sensitive to saturation than I am, or whatever it is, that those things are less this is a bad pun, are less black and white than composition, sort of direct composition. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I just think that it's more gray. I'm making lots of bad jokes, but I mean, they are honestly the words that I would use. Do you think that part of it is because I don't know that you're kind of feeling that we don't necessarily have the same representations of what these colors mean in our brains?
I think broadly, most humans actually do have a very similar index of color understanding. Our eye and brain so closely linked. You could read lots about this in colour theory by so-called experts, who are, of course, experts and know exactly what they're talking about, unlike you and I. But I would say that if you think about how we receive colour, yes, of course, it's subjective. There's also an entire kind of archetypal self in the background there that understands that red means danger. That we're keyed into a deep understanding of colour. And much as I'm saying that it's always surprised me how complacent people are about colour, I obviously am aware that people are also incredibly stimulated by colour. But really what I wonder about sometimes is that that stimulation or that that response to colour is automatic and instinctive rather than considered and reflective. And I would say that I feel privileged that I've spent time working with colour so much, because I do think it has its own authority, its own particular kind of language.
I have, okay, I'm sorry, finish your thought. I have a couple things to say about it, but I don't want to cut you off. Go ahead. Two things. One, as someone who works with color a lot in digital files and dealing with, calibration of monitors and printers and all the rest of it, I know how nebulous color can really be and how it's represented to the final viewer. And so whenever if I see this photograph and I said, if I could snap my fingers, as our magical thing that we like to talk about, and had Joel Meyerowitz here and said, is that what it's supposed to look like? And he said, oh God, no. Actually, that red was a lot more, X. I would not be surprised at all if that were true. I'm not saying that it is true. I'm just saying that it's so in some ways, I feel like I can't trust the color in photographs, not because it's false color or anything like that, but just there's so many things between the person taking the photograph and what they intended and me seeing it that I have no idea where in that spectrum, if it's even close to what they actually wanted it to be.
But isn't that part of the magic? Like color has this quality. Interesting you're talking about this, because when I was picking the photographs to go on here, I had an idea of the actual photographs I wanted.
Yeah.
Notice
and you found multiple different representations of each?
Of course. I mean, they look so different, depending on who's uploaded them, depending on
whether they were scanned from a book or whether they were photographs of a print or whatever.
But actually, in terms of this nuance that I'm talking about, there's a lot of, I suppose if like Ansel Adams were here, he'd be talking to me about the truth of black and white. And really, there's a peculiar kind of magic in color. And it's to do actually with what you're suggesting about there being this endless possibility to the same thing being seen so differently. In actual fact, in the UK press over the last sort of year or so, periodically in my newsfeed, it will pop up, is this dress gold or black?
Oh, yeah, that crap,
Yeah, so there's so many things to do with our perception, how we view things and see things. I love the magic of my eye being my eye.
You like the idea of dancing in clouds.
Are you trying to be poetic, Bill?
No, I would never try to do that with you in the room. But I think that that's true. I think that you like you like that ambiguity.
Because it's like having a sprite. It's like having a fleet fairy somehow around the frame all the time. It changes. And isn't that wonderful in a photograph that freezes everything? That there's still a capacity for this incredible kind of permeability between what is, what was, what could be, how I see it, how you see it, let alone all the various permutations of our actual interpretations of it contextually and conceptually, that we also then simply have color, like color authority. Color authority plays with us. messing with us all the time. I think that's absolutely brilliant. I love that.
See, and I love the idea of, if I go see one of my favorite paintings and they've moved it somewhere and they've changed it so some light is on it that is changing the color of it because it's, the wrong light, or daylight's hitting it and lights in the room are hitting it or whatever, and it shifts things, that drives me up the wall because I think there is a definitive color green that chair is, and I'm not seeing that green because the people who put it here didn't understand light color or whatever. So because I have, I don't know, some weird ultimate respect for wanting to know what the creator intended, specifically know, the color. There's one of the other thing I was going to say about all of these photographers, I think, is that, I mean, Joel shoots digital, but a lot of them are really well known for their color photography that was all film, which means all of them were using daylight film, shooting all of this stuff, not worrying about white balance, like letting the colors shift wherever they did within the daylight sort of balanced film, and how much richness there is in allowing that to happen. And nowadays with modern cameras, almost everyone keeps their white balance automatically corrected. And it's like, no, but by correcting it, you're taking away everything that makes that color of light special, in many ways. If you shoot under tungsten instead of tungsten thing, it's going to look neutral. Well, when you're in the room with tungsten light, it doesn't look neutral, it looks yellow.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so, and if you were in there and Eggleston was in there and took a picture with a light bulb in the room, it would look yellow because that's what it looked like in there. Because I understand that our eyes do all kinds of tricks to sort of shift white, but I think that there's something really interesting in the fact that color photography of this era was so often done with daylight balanced film, which means that the colors are all over the place compared to how they would be if you shot them now and like kept on white balance. It's also interesting, a lot of these guys, I mean, Stephen Shore and Meyerowitz to some extent, there was that era in the 70s of like the big giant 8x10 cameras, and the big film. And there's just, I don't know, I always have something, I have a slight fetish for large format color film. It's like the idea of like, what is in front of my camera is going to be emblazoned on this piece of plastic and be there for all time as accurately as possible in high definition and super sharp.
That's also maybe a little misleading in that actually
poetic.
No, but color also, color shifts over time. Color.
Oh, sure.
A lot of the photographs that we've returned to, people will be maybe listening to us thinking, oh, she mentioned earlier about Saul Leiter at the beginning of the 1980s.
Sure.
These photographs from way before. Yes, they were a lot of the work that we would want to talk about for Leiter in this context is from way before the early 80s. But what I mean is that actually he wasn't renowned as a color fine art photographer or street photographer until later. And again, this is to do with the snobbery that was part of the kind of the art elite not really wanting to accept color photography as an art medium. It was a commercial or
well, can we also say though that the art world and the business of art has nothing to do with art, in the sense that just, galleries and museums deciding what is good does not make the stuff they choose good and other stuff not good.
Well, you would think that, but actually, of course, Bill, the world knows that if some fancy person somewhere in a gallery says, here, buy this for £1 million, some person somewhere is probably going to buy it for £1 million.
Oh, I'm sure. I guess my point is that, Saul Leiter was taking those pictures for 30, 40 years before anybody noticed. Mm-hmm. They were there. They were wonderful. Some people must have seen them and no one said, oh my God, these are God's gift to street photography from the 50s, the way they did 30, 40 years later. The only thing that changed was society's perception of that work. That work did not change in those 40 years.
No,
So,
but also, you know, you think about equivalencies again across other art forms. You know, a lot of the photographers we're going to look at still even are somehow linked to painters like Hopper
sure.
and would be synonymous with that kind of North American spareness in all other ways. Like, you know, these photographs we're looking at, you know, they are spare, they are saturated with color, but my goodness, everything else is obviously banal, it's ordinary.
You also chose photographs of at least these two with no people in them.
Yeah, I think also I just want to say one more thing before we move on from this photograph. And we could talk so much about each of these photographs. You know, we didn't really even talk about the Eggleston photograph properly.
Yeah, we could dig into each of them for an hour and a half too. Yeah.
Yeah, but I would like to say that Meyerowitz said about being a photographer, it's almost like a second personality emerges when you'd make photographs. That everything was very, very fast paced, and suddenly
Okay.
to make the photographs he had to slow right down, and it was like he became this other person in order to really merge with what he could see to make the photograph. And I thought that then is so interesting in terms of us talking about how color is multiplicit, you know, because actually the photographer has multiple personalities with which to meet the color in the first place, as much as we have multiple personalities with which to meet the color we receive when we see. So there's like endless possibilities in color. I mean, you could argue it's the same in black and white photography with tone and but I don't feel it the way I do with color. Like the color is immersive. It is,
Alive.
yeah, it is. And actually there's a whole conversation about, you know, is the past alive and photographs stop time and how photographs really are dead things. And I've said that myself before, photographs are dead things. But color breathes life into everything.
When you were doing more color darkroom stuff back in the day, did you imagine that you were trying to recreate what was in the negative, or were you trying to create a whole other thing?
Whole other thing.
Okay.
But I wasn't, sometimes, I know this sounds obscure or contrived or something, but I obviously wanted to make photographs that represented the spaces I had engaged with. But I wasn't hell-bent on trying to find like an external truth with that, because I realized the impossibility of that actually. That I can go for that, I can reach for that, but that I probably won't ever attain that. And
No, but yeah, go ahead.
there's just a whole sense with photographs that much as we try to, they are the evidence that we can never actually really hold on to time. You know, we think they're the evidence that we can stop everything, but they don't. And color does that for me more than a black and white photograph does. Time is not able to be fixed in a color photograph.
Yeah.
There's a grand statement.
You could tell that this is a Stephen Shore photograph because there's a Sitco sign in it.
Well, Stephen Shore, you know, I mean, this is, again, was Eggleston credited with like being a pioneer of color photography.
Yep.
Does that annoy me? As I said earlier, yes, it does.
I'm sure that there were a number of women photographers who were doing very similar work at the same time who never got the day in the sun.
You've got Jan Brooke, for example. You know, there are lots of women. I can't even name. That's how depressing this is. I can't even name them. I don't know their names. I can't say them.
Let alone non-white photographers.
I just have to say,
like, the same thing.
It's like we've become a collective noun. You know, think of something. But women photographers. it's so depressing. I mean, again, it's not lost on me. I'm talking always, really, with the exception of Justine Reyes. I have only ever spoken to male photographers or artists.
We've got to fix that.
Yeah, I've been trying. It's fascinating to try and make contact with female artists and have them agree to speak with me.
They don't want to speak with you?
No. And I do wonder about it. I've spoken to quite a few people about it. I've spoken to my dad about it a lot because I find it quite frustrating. And I do wonder if it's that there's an automatic sense that when I approach a male artist, that perhaps I'm being horribly sexist with this myself, but that perhaps men just have an automatic sense that they're entitled to talk about what they do. Whereas with women, there's a bit more caution. It's much riskier for a woman.
Wait, why is it riskier for women to talk about their work?
It shouldn't be. I'm not saying it's right, but I think
I don't know that it is. That might be their perception, but I don't know that that's true.
Well, if it's their perception, it's real for them nonetheless, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess, but go ahead.
You and I will always talk because we talk, right?
Yeah.
It makes no difference to either of us in the sense we're talking about now that you're male and I'm female. But what I've noticed across all of the interviews I've done is that it's not lost on me that everybody I'm speaking to is male. It's not lost on me that when I'm putting together all these shows, all these presentations, that what we're looking at so many times is the work of male artists and
Sure.
predominantly white male artists and also North American white male artists.
Yep.
But anyway, this is off on a tangent. We can do a whole other show.
That's a whole other show.
Let's do.
Are you making a list of these other shows that we're going to be doing?
We need to start planning them now. But can we just go back to Stephen Shore for a second?
Sure, Stephen Shore.
So, beauty or not beauty? Bill.
Stephen Shore. There is work of Stephen Shore's that I think is sublime. There's a stillness to Stephen Shore's photographs. There's like I will say that at least of the stuff that I really like, the sort of middle period of Stephen Shore, the stuff that he's really known for is the stuff that I tend to like more. And that's not always true of every photographer, but it is for him. That it feels somehow like definitive, like that photograph couldn't have been taken any other way. Like it's sitting on granite somehow. And I don't know why that is. I think maybe because at the time he was shooting with these giant cameras and it took so much time to actually make the photograph that the decisions, it was dialed in to an extent that Eggleston walking around with a little camera going, it's just different. Like there's a structure to his work. Everything's, parallel lines are usually parallel. There's like a very particular composition style that he has that definitely I feed off of as somebody who likes things straight and sitting in the right corner. So in that way, he kind of pushes my buttons in a good way. There is, though, like we were saying earlier, this weird arrogance of photographers of that era, a lot of them, where it's interesting because, if you look at some older photographers, if you look at, Cartier-Bresson, or you look at Man Ray, or you look at, either Dorothea Lange or whatever it is, right? I don't think that, Cartier-Bresson to some extent, he was also, a rich kid who was just tooling around taking pictures. But there I don't think that there was this, it feels to me like with Eggleston and Shore that they think that they're the end of the line somehow. You know what I mean? Like, I am the culmination of everything that is great that has ever happened in my art. Like, it feels like that's, I don't know, there's this sense that I get from them in that way. Fair or not, that's the feeling I have. And I think part of it might be to do with the fact that both of them were creating the work that is best known at the time that I was born, like in the mid 70s.
Mm.
And so there's something about it that feels both touchable and also nostalgic simultaneously for me.
Yeah, I think color has this capacity to bring up lots of things for people. You know, nostalgia is so persuasive in a
Yeah,
photograph.
yeah, and I think you're right though. The color is a lot of what has to do with it. I mean, you can look at the shingles, you know, on the side of this building, or the cinder blocks down the bottom, or what have you, and you could almost imagine if you and I got in a car and went to wherever this is. If this building is still there, we could go touch that concrete, and it would feel like you would imagine it would feel.
Mm.
You know, there's something about
So I think
that.
that's the thing for me with Shore's work actually, is that very often there is, you're talking about it now, this idea of a nostalgia, but it's multi-layered in the formal elements of how he shoots. And that's in part to do with how he uses color to kind of correct himself within the frame for texture and tone as well. Whereas with Eggleston, I don't necessarily find that. I find lots of convergence with line. And again, even if it's out of rhythm, there still is a formalism. There's still,
Yeah,
um,
Stephen Shore likes to square things off in a
yeah.
way that
So
Eggleston does not.
at first glance, I would always say that Shore is much more systemized, formalized than
Yep,
Eggleston.
yep.
Um, I always like thinking that his parent, I mean, he came from a pretty decent background as well in terms of our, other sort of idea of privilege and richness. His parents
Do
had
we,
a handbag factory, I think.
I didn't know. Do you see either or any of these particular guys that we're talking about as sort of the heir to Walker Evans and that kind of era of sort of places, you know?
Well, I don't think that any of this can exist without. I don't think any of this can exist without. Um, well, Walker Evans probably feeds into any photographer.
Yeah, but especially like the idea of I'm going to take a picture of this place that I see, and somehow it's going to have this permanence, simultaneous permanence and nostalgia, you know?
Well, I mean,
Uh,
there's lots of stuff that would say that you've got people like Gary Winogrand or William Klein.
sure.
They're working in black and white, sure, but they are doing very similar
Oh, see,
things.
I see those people as very different
Oh, I
than
don't.
these guys.
I find them as
I,
super.
I feel, oh, I see Klein and Winogrand as much looser, much more kinetic, like a
Mm,
much more like this is what's in front of me. I'm taking the picture. I'm moving on. Like there's like this like almost a dance to their work.
but I do find that. I mean, I find that Shore is maybe the wrong example to have up on the screen right now for this conversation. But I do think that, you're asking about, does like Walker Evans feed into this, or Weston, or
Yeah,
any other big names, Cartier
sure.
Bresson? How does he arrive in this work?
Yeah.
Well, they all do. They all have their place
It
at the table. But in
does it
terms
kind of feel like what gear you're in though? Like Stephen Shore's in first gear all the time. Like he's slow and going along, and then there's the people like Carter Bresson are walking around and like maybe they see something, maybe they wait for a minute or two, but they're like in second or third gear, you know, when they're doing their thing.
well, to me,
Uh,
Ernst Haas is the person who's possibly several gears up.
yeah, interestingly enough, too, very, I mean, not that Meyerowitz isn't, but uh, Ernst Haas is very sort of New York. It's got that kinetic energy of of like the mid 20th century American city going on in it, you know.
It does, but you're talking about quietness in Shore's work. I find incredible quietness in Ernst Haas's work.
Interesting. Okay.
Mm, maybe that's to do with his particular type of formalism. I toyed with two images. There was this one, and then there's another one, which is another store window with awnings. It's got lots of red in it. I had too much red for me for this particular presentation because I'm coming into red with the others in a minute. But
I think it's interesting that you chose this picture. I think this is very much sort of a transitional thing to the next person. in an interesting way. So I don't know if you
Are
plan
you
that or not.
suggesting that there's actually a method to the way I put the presentation together?
No, I would never suggest that with you in the room.
Mm. Wow, Ernst Haas.
Yeah.
What could you say about Ernst Haas?
I just think about, sorry, this has nothing to do with anything. However, I do, something about the elevated train line just kind of makes me go, oh, right, elevated train lines. There was a thing about, especially New York in sort of the 50s, 60s, 40s, 50s, 60s. I don't know if it was the color of the paints or the fabrics, or it was Kodachrome, or it was a combination of all of those things. But you can't take pictures that look quite like this anymore. It was a very particular thing at a very particular time.
Yeah, and I spent a lot of time at art college, going to car boot sales and flea markets and trying to find old and obviously out of date film.
Sure.
And going and shooting with it and finding out what would happen, and actually discovering that a lot of photographs we were taking could end up actually looking like something from.
Yeah, that it had to do with the materials as much as it had to do with the vision of the artist.
Yeah, so that materiality is yet another layer to color, and it goes back into
Sure.
something like you were saying about, you want to go and take this giant negative plate of color, that it's embossed somehow, that it's permanent.
Yeah.
And actually my point would be that with color, color is very difficult to fix. Color is going to move about. There's going to be a lot of color slip over time.
Sure. Although it is amazing how good Kodachrome stuff still looks if you pull it out.
Yes, it is.
Amazing.
But I do wonder about this, and I wonder if there's anybody watching who knows anything about this, because I'm very interested. I want to find out more about this. It's like when you think about, the Coulthard Institute here has a highly prestigious course for people who want to go and learn painting restoration, right?
Yep.
And so that is really about people prolonging the lifespan of pigment in paint from hundreds of years ago, usually. But I wonder with photographs, like, how are we going to retain the integrity of photographs like 500 years from now?
We're going to scan them and have digital files of them.
Yes, but then again, there's this sense that over time, it's that sprite of change that maybe we have to accept that actually photographs in color are going to just die.
It's interesting, can we take a little 2-minute tangent just for a second?
Okay.
In the idea of curating and supporting old materials, it's a lot of oil paintings last a long time because oils, it's a very stable medium, and like these oil paintings from 400 years ago, they may get a lot of gook on the outside of them, but it's usually all under there, you know what I mean, once you clean it off.
Mm-hmm.
But you look at some of the stuff, especially if you go to someplace like MoMA, and you think, wow, these guys were just using crappy enamel house paint, and this thing is falling apart because they never meant for it to last for 200 years. Those materials were not designed to be archival. It's the same problem. My sister used to work at the Smithsonian, and I was talking to one of the people at the Air and Space Museum, and we were talking about, the suits that went to the moon. And I have that's one of my sort of pet subjects are the moon landings. And so I'm talking to the guy, and I said, it's crazy. You guys have, all of these suits. Like, how do you deal with it? These things were not designed to last forever. He says, no, there are rubber O-rings in them that are cracking and falling apart and brittle and all the rest of it. And I said, what do you do from sort of a philosophical point of view? Do you replace that O-ring so that there's some sense of what this object was, or do you just let it decay because you don't want to change the fact that everything in this suit, for example, was on the moon at one point, And he says, this is the conversation we have every single day. And I said, this is why I can't do what you do, because I would just sit there and be frozen by that. But go ahead. There's my end of my tangent.
No, that tangent is so relevant to this. relevant to the whole of photography, actually. You know, when we make a photograph, are we conscious of our part in archiving? And you know, there's so much. Always we go to this thing. I teach it every year. I say the same thing about, you know, photographs freeze time. It suspends a moment. It's like embedded in the language of talking about photography, teaching photography. But really, for me personally, privately, the sense of that capturing of the moment, you know, the past. I've already said in this talk, you know, the past isn't dead in color photographs because the color is going to change. And so somehow there's an invigoration of what has been there. And that actually going into the future, thinking about how we preserve color photographs, thinking about the point at which the photograph was made. You know, is somebody making something for the sake of beauty, and can that stand alone, and what does that mean? But equally, does somebody make a photograph for the purpose of time, and does that stand alone, and what does that mean? And then further still into the future, again, we think, well, when these photographs are gone and there is an inability to see the photograph, you know, there's lots of layers to how we might think about how we not just preserve an image, but how we preserve a notion.
Notion?
Yeah, no.
The notion that was the artist's notion?
Any sense that we might look back and think that somebody thought of this. Do we know it because of the photograph? We're heavily reliant on photographs telling us what we think is the truth about the past in so many ways. But understanding and accepting that those photographs are changing very slowly, but they're changing, you know, does that change our relationship with the past they kind of
represent,
seek to convey to us?
Yeah.
There's so many things in that. I mean, thinking about this photograph, Haas has got quite a lot of highly, I would say, imaginative work, fine art photographs that, you know, they're much more obscure in the archive of his work. I just want to read something. He said that that he is or was bored with obvious reality. I found my fascination in transforming it into a subjective point of view.
Wait, can you reread that?
So he said he's bored with obvious reality. I find my fascination in transforming it into a subjective point of view.
You know, I was watching a documentary about Eggleston last night that I'd watched years ago just to sort of prep for this a little bit.
Were you doing some homework, Bill?
I remembered watching this documentary. I was like, I want to see that again. So I ended up watching, actually it was
You're trying to start me.
I watched some of the documentary and then realized that the documentary was boring. And so I ended up watching a BBC4 show that used a lot of the footage from the documentary and also had interviews with him in it. You know, his big thing was that I photograph, what is it, life as it is now or something like that. You know, I think this is like his famous thing of like what he chooses to photograph. He's like, I photograph life now. And it's interesting because he liked the idea of the superficial, where you're saying Ernst Haas wanted to, as best he could without special effects, manipulate reality to be something more than what it was in front of his lens.
Well, I'm not even sure if the word manipulate.
Find the right angle so that it was changed like this, like with this reflection and everything that's going on in this one.
I think this is generosity.
This is generosity? The photograph is generosity.
Yeah, this is a generous photograph.
Explain that to me.
So I often find Eggleston's photographs very beautiful, but quite mean. I feel the same about Stephen Shore's work. It gives us what it wants to give us. And yes, we can create kind of subjective make-believe imaginary narratives to connect to it, but that's our own storytelling capacity guiding that. So I think though when we see a Haas photograph, we're already given something very freely that is so rich. I mean, this comes back to the title. There's so much visual information in something that has little visual information that makes a full story. I find the same here, you know, there's a sense that I can go away, I can riff in my own fantasy world about what this is. But it's almost like I could just stay with this photograph. I could give it my complete attention for a long, long time. And I would never, ever get bored of it. And I find the same with Haas, whereas I do get bored of the others eventually.
Interesting. Do you think it has anything to do with the fact that you know about these people who made these images and you put some of their personality onto the images?
Well, we kind of said about that earlier. You know, Eggleston is not a particularly, for me, likable character.
Yeah.
I would probably assume, there we go, I'm assuming again, but I would assume, Stephen Shore, you've said, I think we're agreeing about this, there's a sense of maybe arrogance or entitlement to their perceived greatness. By the way, Haas came from quite a privileged background as well, just as a point, you know, he had government official parents.
Sure.
In Austria. He didn't come from poverty. You know, there's a sense that maybe he is the one I said earlier, he is described as the great poet of colour photography. And perhaps that's because people who come from privilege have so much more time to be able to kind of meander in their creativity, to allow it to come out. They have the time. There's no risk involved for people who come from privilege in the same way that there is, of course, for somebody who comes from poverty. There's not, there's a different struggle. There can be similar struggles, but there's not the same struggle and sense of risk. You know, somebody who's just wandering around with a camera, if you've got 5 kids and no money, I wonder how much of a poet you would be. That's not in any way diminishing those who so poetically express through whatever art form they choose, you know, whether they come from a background of meager means or of plenty. But I do think that there is a kind of proclivity in wealth for this kind of reflection, sort of emotional, psychological, philosophical reflection.
Yeah, and I think that the separation of rich and poor, I mean, is also a very long and gray scale in the sense that, you know, I'm not looking for food on the street, but I also am not rich enough that I can just go sit on an island for the rest of my life, you know. So I mean, everything's a long ruler. You know, it's interesting for this photograph, to me, as lovely as I think it is, it's about that guy out the window.
Mm. Well, why are you saying that as if that's a bad thing?
I'm not, except that the other photographs you've pulled out have no people in them.
No, but they're also people, aren't they? All of these are about people.
They're about people, but there aren't people in them. Those are two different things.
You know, there's actually, in terms of color photography, really, there's so little that I know about color photography that is not about people. Black and white, you know, we've got Adams, you know, flying the flag, leading the light brigade for landscape. Yeah, I mean, even in a contemporary way, my lovely friend Keith Dotson, you know, nature.
Sure.
A lot of the time, you know, black and white, very studied, very beautiful. Color is like people in one way, isn't it? You know, that doesn't discount. I know that there are really well-regarded, excellent color photographers who shoot nature.
But I think that
Porter, for example, but you know, all of these whether they have a form in them or not, the fact is they're all about people.
Yeah, but I instantly light up when I see the guy out there in a way. And maybe that shows my own bias towards actual people.
Fred Herzog just went around Vancouver and took loads of pictures. And that's
Sure.
not to diminish him at all. But again, he's one of these people who was just kind of like left. He was unsung. Nobody cared really that much. Wasn't until later.
Canadian Saul Leiter.
Kind of, yeah. The difference is that, Saul Leiter was well regarded as a photographer, just not as the photographer you or I might think of him as. Leiter was shooting for fashion magazines.
Sure.
You
ever watch his documentary, by the way?
He was doing well. No, I haven't seen that.
You really need to. In no great hurry.
That's my homework.
It's very good. Go ahead.
Herzog, thinking about how color has an interplay with non-color, I think he's masterful at that. So what I mean by that is where he doesn't have to overstimulate us with color in the same way the others might.
Yeah, it's not as saturated.
The colors are saturated, like that red is saturated. If we were
it is, but there's something it's less blaring somehow than some of the other people.
Yeah, it has its own reservations, I think.
Yeah.
Lots of people see this work very much as an archive of a particular time of kind of like mid-century Vancouver. It was kind of a bit of a rundown city. But it's, again, lots of people describe it as very nostalgic. People who live in Vancouver would look at this now and sort of fondly remember.
Sure.
Because of these photographs. But in terms of somebody who's not using them as an aid for memory, just meeting them fresh and thinking about them in context of color, they're so gentle with us. Even when the colors are saturated, the color is saturated. It's rich color. But the way that Herzog is, as I said, masterful is that he gives us the space in non-color to appreciate what we're looking at. He's not shouting.
I don't disagree with a lot of the statements you make about the work of these photographers, but do you think that they are consciously thinking the things that you're saying, or do you think these are just choices that their brain makes without them thinking?
I think there's a lot of conscious making. I think the one who's possibly least conscious in a funny way is Eggleston.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree with that.
These are all, I would say that really apart from the Eggleston, and particularly my favorite Eggleston photograph, I would say all of these have got a level of kind of consideration that sets them apart. That idea you mentioned earlier, you had 500 photographs. Could you separate out the 500 of these people's work? What differentiates them from what you could just pick up on really any wannabe street photographer's Instagram?
I would like to say though that I think their best work does stand out, but I think that the majority of the stuff that they probably shoot probably falls in a much more general category. But
there's also a sense that there are so many very fine photographers.
Yes.
I'm thinking about someone like I interviewed Taylor Coble a couple of months ago, and he has a relatively big following on Instagram. He's a street photographer. A lot of his work is very similar to some of the work I would see here. And likewise, even the street stuff of Daniel Sigg, who I met the other week, it's like a tradition now, isn't it? There's a fine.
Yeah, Rinzi Ruiz out in LA does the same kind of thing where it's got a very particular look. Yeah, I mean, you're right though that all of that sort of stuff that people do now, as beautiful as it is, and it's really beautiful. In fact, I was going back and forth with Taylor about a couple of his pictures recently. that they do feel like they are from the it's like they're jazz players playing bebop. It's like you could be amazing, but ultimately this was a form of music that was created 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's like, yes, you're doing it now, and so therefore it's different because the things you're photographing are slightly different, but it's in the same vocabulary.
Yeah, and I think that
Yeah.
comes back to this much broader sense that it's really important. I think it's important for me to remember. I speak to my students a lot about this. It's like art doesn't exist in a vacuum. That's what my art teacher used to say to me. Like nothing comes from nothing. So something has always come from something else. And we see how these pioneers have kind of informed what we're doing. There's tiny little bits of Saul Leiter in, in actually, maybe we could say every conscious color photograph. It's whether or not the thing is self-conscious. There's a difference, isn't there?
Yeah. I also, every time I look at Saul's photographs, I think if you shot this digitally and actually boosted the saturation so that the colors looked like this, it would look wrong. But somehow on film, it looks different and right.
This was the hardest one, by the way, to actually, I've had to plump for a version of this photograph that's not as good quality. It's not as high pixel.
Do you have the early color book?
I do. But I had to do that because this was the version that had, as far as I think, coming back to this point we were talking about earlier, that has the closest alignment to what I know is in the book.
Yep.
It was really hard. Some of them are like crazily off the scale. They're too dark. They're too saturated. It was actually very time consuming going through lots of them, making them big on the screen. But anyway, Saul Leiter, he was going to be a rabbi. Again, came from kind of an auspicious background. His dad was a very well-regarded scholar. Saul Leiter moved to New York. He wasn't a New York native. He came from Pittsburgh. And decided that rather than become a rabbi, he was going to be an artist, a visual artist. And I think that's interesting that he believed himself to be a visual artist, because as I was saying, he wasn't actually considered to be a visual artist until the early 80s, when people started rooting around really in the archive of his work. And I've written it down somewhere. I love it. He said, "What makes anyone think that I'm any good?"
When I saw him give a talk, the time I sat next to him at a luncheon, he gets up there and he's like, "I don't know why I'm even up here. People look at my pictures and they think that they're good. I don't know." I mean, he was very self-deprecating. Very sort of like
Eggleston would be sitting there telling everyone that he's a genius.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, that is what he told a reporter from, the New York Times.
Oh, sure.
And
what's he got to lose?
Yeah, he's not wrong, is he? He's not wrong.
Well, he's not wrong, but it's, genius has levels of degree, and I think that he's not wrong, but him saying it doesn't make his work better. In the same way that Saul Leiter being self-deprecating doesn't make his work worse. The work is what it is to some extent. I would prefer somebody be generally self-deprecating than cocky as all get up.
Yeah, but is that not your own arrogance, demanding things of others?
Yeah, maybe.
Just saying.
But I mean, look at this. Talk about just a sense of place with the color and the cars. And there's that one picture of like a postman going through the snow. The snow's coming down, and then there's the shot through the window where there's like a smear on the. It's like his stuff is. Each shot is like a movie, especially.
Yes. I've got something to say about that, because actually we've not talked actually yet about the kind of filmic qualities, the cinematic qualities in
Sure.
all of these photographs, but of course there is. And I just want to
Yeah.
read something, Wim Wenders talking, who has moments of incredible insight, but equally, I think a lot of people find him extraordinarily irritating. I actually get the impression that lots of visual artists find him extraordinarily irritating. But, you know, you can read a lot about him. One of my most favorite movies is Paris, Texas. And, you know, it's like if you were to freeze that movie at any point, you would have a beautiful still photograph. You know, it's really excellent in terms of, for me, how color is quietened but still so profoundly impactful. Anyway, I mean, he has now exhibited as a fine art photographer. He said, every photo, every once in time, is also the beginning of a story. Every photo is the first frame in a movie. And actually, I know he said that, but I always think that of this. Like every photograph of Saul Leiter's is the beginning of a movie.
Yeah. And I don't think there's any, I mean, there are people out there who do Eggleston-esque work. There's people out there who do Stephen Shore-esque work. I haven't seen anybody who does stuff that really feels like Saul Leiter to me.
There's a guy in London who does it. He's on my Instagram. I wish I could remember his name. Sean Tucker.
Okay.
And he.
Oh, Sean Tucker, sure. Yeah.
No, it's not Sean Tucker. It's Sean Tucker. I can't remember his name. It was Sean Tucker who introduced.
Oh, okay.
To him. I will find that out and I'll put it in my my description for this video.
Okay.
But he shoots very like Saul Leiter. But again, I wonder if it's like a parody almost.
Sure.
If that person is meeting what he sees, trying to emulate Saul Leiter, if it's genuinely just how he shoots. And of course, we never know that, do we?
Look at this picture. Well, we don't know whether or not he's unconsciously doing it. Look at the amount of negative space in the lower half of this picture, except for this one giant tick of white reflection that sort of makes it so it's not broken down there, you know? I mean, like, you couldn't have painted this better if you wanted to. It's just, guy kills me.
Okay, we just got this one.
All right.
We have to stop because we might actually break our record for jabbering on at each other.
People can't stand it, I know, so we'll have to shorten it up for next time.
It's the pits. Anyway, again, I apologize for the quality of the image, but again, it was the only one where the color was as close as I could see, was as close to what I knew it should be based on what I think Paul Outerbridge would have wanted. So there we go. There's all the permutations of how I had to choose this particular version. I just want to mention him because I think he is somebody who is so shunted away from spectacular fame. He's obviously very well known, but what I mean is that, you know, someone like Eggleston, again, this is part of the thing about personality in photographs and how the personality of the photographer does often impact the photograph. Outerbridge was a proper pioneer of color photography. In the sense that, you know, he's also, he's the oldest of all the photographers that we've talked about. So he was there first. And his color work originally was based very much in the studio setting. And he was very, very well known in his early career as a color commercial photographer. Do you know about him? Do you know much about him?
Yes. Yeah. Keep going though.
Well, do you want to pitch in?
No, go ahead. You're on a roll.
So then later, really, I think when he tried to kind of break through into making more what he would maybe think of as personal work, he was utterly rejected by the art establishment, and he fell into virtual obscurity. He went and I think he had a small photographic studio where he made portraits of people. And he just kind of disappeared. And there's kind of like a revivalist movement now into Outerbridge because we realize now that because we've moved away from this incredible elitism about color and how, you know, it's brash and trashy and only for adverts, we can see the quality of how he worked with color as a crafts person.
Sure.
Anyway,
I mean, I think,
photograph,
go
because
ahead.
actually this is from the period in his life where he knew he was kind of done for, in this fallow period, where he wasn't adored, he wasn't remembered, he wasn't recognized. And this is a self-portrait, and shot in Santa Monica in, I think, 1955. And
Isn't that sometimes when the best work is made, though, when you stop caring about other people and what they think of it?
well, yes, yes. Isn't that the lesson to all of us?
Yeah, yeah. But I will tell you, as somebody who is a commercial photographer who constantly gets told what I should make in order to be noticed, uh, you do get a lot of external, you know, noise to the contrary.
He was, Outerbridge was left behind by the color photography that he had championed. I find that very poignant as a kind of story, an anecdote to go alongside
Well,
what
I
I.
think it's a tragedy that the world wasn't ready yet. It's not that he wasn't ready. It's not that his work wasn't the same. It's that it took another 20 years for anybody in the art world to come to terms with this, with the idea that color could add something.
The person I was talking about earlier, the female color photographer, was Jan Groover. I couldn't remember her name properly.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Jan Groover actually was working very much in a studio sense in color in a similar way, I think, to Outerbridge. Actually, there's parity between them, not just because of color, but because of sort of other subtle ticks within their work.
I mean, there's compositional stuff that Outerbridge did in black and white that was also just, I mean, the man had skills.
Yeah, he did. And you know what? I think this is actually, I don't want to do Eggleston a disservice, because maybe there is a lot of work and he works really, really hard. But actually, Outerbridge worked really hard at this
Sure,
craft. And I
sure.
resent the fact, in a way, that he's not more remembered, because he, he was a master of the tri-carbon color process. It took like hours and hours and hours for them to make prints. Like this laborious sense of making something. This is also something to mention about digital photography and the swiftness with which we can arrive at an outcome, and
Yep.
done, it's over. I think we should be so much more respectful to the traditional craft that came before, and
Stuff that took a long time.
it's just mindful.
There also is something you're saying, though, in there, that the idea is, you're basically saying, Outerbridge had to work to get to this point, and Eggleston, whether or not he had to work to get to that point, and not to say that he isn't taking pictures all the time, it's obviously something he very much cares about, but there is this oeuvre that he projects, that it was always there. It was just a matter, like, it was talent over hard work. You know what I'm saying? In some sense. And as somebody who I don't think is particularly talented, but I think that I work hard, whenever anybody says, "Oh, your work's so lovely, you're so talented," I don't like that. I see that as a knock against me, because you're sort of assuming that it's not that you like my work and you think it's good because I worked really hard to get there, that it was innate and it was just there and I just had to, like, click the picture or whatever it is. And I feel like the whole idea of talent in the way that we talk about it in the arts is almost never true, and it almost always is hard work. And I don't know why people always talk about it as if it's better, as if it's not hard work to get there. You know what I'm saying? The phenom is better than the person who worked their ass off for 20 years. And I mean, to your point,
It's the same. I think girls find this all the time. It's like, you work really hard at school,
yep,
and the thing that people remember about girls is the way we all remember the way we look, right? People look.
sure.
But with girls, there's the immediate sense that they're judged only for the way they look. Obviously, that's changing more, but there's so much diminishment of one's accomplishments.
Yes.
You know, it's immediately squashed down. I see it all the time. I see it with my daughter's little friends, you know, oh, she's so pretty. You know, all the mums talking about the other girls, all the daughters.
Sure.
And I think, you know, is that it? Is that what we've got? You know,
Well,
there's
a lot of people. I think to some extent it's that people don't know what else to say, and that's become the vernacular, right? You know what I mean? For all this stuff, girls are pretty. People who are really good at something are talented. You know what I mean? Like,
but isn't it funny, because the thing that may be intended as a kindness and like an elevation of something and admiration actually completely squashes it. I do.
Yes, absolutely.
Just one final thing about Outerbridge I really do want to say is that he was really very, very supportive to young photographers who were emerging. He was not some guy who did really well at something and kept it for himself. Again, this idea of generosity, this has been like a running theme with quite a few conversations I've had recently. He championed young photographers. He was generous to them. He mentored lots of people who were kind of on the rise. I'm very sad when I think about the period of his life in which he was forgotten.
Yeah. But then again, here's a question for another time, because it's a longer question, is, does it matter? Honestly, does it matter? He made the work he made. We all do the things that we do. Whether people remember us after we're gone or not, what does it matter? We're gone too.
What does it matter?
I don't know. I struggle with this question constantly.
But we're talking about it also in terms of photographs as well, aren't we?
Sure, which is this weird thing where you said that, like, we're trying to create permanence out of a moment, right? I mean, that's like half the goal of photography in many ways.
But that's why color is such a sprite and to be celebrated, because it won't let us fix it for long.
Yeah.
Anyway, Bill, it is, as always, such a pleasure.
Absolutely. Anytime.
And I will speak to you very soon.
All right. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Sandy.